Elegant paper. And I think I understand, and it moved a little quickly at the end, but as I understand this distinction between natural teleology and desired teleology, natural teleology is what works at the level of the petite perception, and it involves the embodiment of the laws in the way in which the petite perception evolve, but that is supposed to also underlie the what you call the gross teleology, the desire teleology, right? My question is, presumably there's going to be a difference between rational creatures like ourselves who are capable of acting by free will and bare monads. How is this reflected in your account? And is there room for freedom?
Tagged on that last point.
Well, I mean, but that's the real real question.
Yeah, the answer is yes, and I give the answer to that question in Leibniz on Spontaneity, the paper in the Cover and Rutherford volume on the topic. But let me come back. I don't know if I really want to say anything about freedom, but I'll try. But let me first address
or at least voluntary. Voluntary.
Let me address the more general question. Okay. I mean, here's the way I'm seeing it. Imagine that my perception was not defined by the perspective of an agent. Imagine that the content of my perception was really, like we use this analogy of the motion picture, and it was just kind of, the representation of a physical world moving by. And you say, well, why do we go from one represented state of a physical world to another represented state? And you say, well, there are appetitive forces that are moving from one to another. And you say, well, are those appetitive forces end directed in a certain way? Is there a kind of teleology? Yes, there is a kind of teleology. What is that teleology? Well, there's a kind of optimal order underlying the physical world itself, and you want to explain why I went from this representational state to this representational state. It's because those states are representing that optimal order of the physical world, okay? So that's the background account. Now stick an agent in, right? Now stick an organism in, and that organism, right, has certain ends that are related to its own well-being, its own survival, its own flourishing, its own pursuit of pleasure, right? All of those things are the goods of that organism. This is true whether that organism is merely a sensitive creature or a rational creature. The conception of the good relevant to it is different in the different cases. In the case of animals like Bayle's dog, it's merely the pursuit of pleasure, right? So with me so far? Yep. Mm-hmm. So what we've got now is a sort of layering of a second notion of teleology, what I'm calling desired teleology, on top of the first layer, right? And it's a notion of teleology that's specifically associated with the good of a living creature, of an embodied creature. And in that way, we get, on the first sort of notion, there's just one conception of the good order of the universe. Now we get a whole bunch of different competing conceptions of a good proper to individuals, creatures, right? Obviously, in the case of us, as rational creatures, we're able to pursue the good as the good. That's the highest state of existence that we can get to. I operate under a concept of the good. Animals don't do that. Animals pursue the good under the representation of pleasure as being the good. I'm assuming here that, even dumber corporeal substances pursue it also. Not exactly how they do that, what the proper way of conceiving of the good in that case is, but you can imagine it doing it, okay? Mm-hmm. So what we have is, in a sense, a kind of, we have a kind of pre-established harmony of a certain sort between two kinds of teleology realized within the representational state of the thing, whereby any organism is pursuing its good, right, acting for the sake of the good. And then there's also a sort of bringing about of a representation of the physical world within which that organism represents itself as existing, right? Now, the crux of the paper, right, is that the deterministic aspect is made out at the level of the representations of the physical world, which are understood in terms of the operation of these fit laws. There is not the same kind of determinism at the level of what I'm calling gross appetites or desires, right? Because, you can have a desire for something X. Sometimes that thing is satisfied, sometimes it's not. You know, there's, you know, when I say I pursue that which I represent as the greatest good or the greatest apparent good, that's not deterministically correlated with any particular outcome. The existence of that appetite, and even with that law, right, that I pursue the greatest apparent good is the law of appetite there. That is not a deterministic law. That's the main point. So if you want to account for the evolution of the monad's states, you have to fall back on the way in which the representation of the physical world evolved. And to do that, I don't see any other explanation in Leibniz but an appeal to the physical laws themselves.
Mm-hmm. But what is the relationship? The thing that I'm finding a little difficult is the relationship between the desire teleology and the natural teleology.
Well, I mean, the desire teleology is you know,
they operate at different levels, but aren't the levels connected in some way?
well, yeah, the desire teleology is always instantiated through I take it a corporeal organism, right?
Right.
Or a thing that represents itself as a corporeal living body, right? So it's always sort of, you know, that's why I sort of said, you know, it's in some sense it's imposed upon or added to the physical world, that there are these one kind of physical things that do pursue something that they represent as their own good, right? So the new kind of teleology is added there, a teleology that's linked to the individual's actual
physical state.
Well, it's actually its desires, what it represents as its good or things to be pursued, right? Yeah.
I'm still, yeah.
I'm not explaining it clearly enough then,
What worries? I don't want to take too much time.
Yeah.
But what worries me a little, what confuses me a little bit, is that the desire teleology in some way or another is supposed to arise from the natural teleology going on at the level of the petite perception, isn't it? In a way, it's a redescription of what it is that's going on at the
I mean, you know, maybe, you know,
bottom
sort of,
level.
You know, it's something like the relationship between functionalism and physicalism, right? I mean, the functional state is one kind of description, and you know, it's taken always to be instantiated or realized by a physical state.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense to me.
Okay. If that satisfies you.
Steve, can you get the microphone? Maybe the other one. I think that one's faster. So I have a question about the implication of two of the passages from Leibniz for how we should understand, on Leibniz's terms, the nature of occasionalism. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to stir up trouble between you and Bob, but if we look at, well, I will, though. Passage 2 at the end, it says, "It's not enough to say that God has made a general law, for besides this decree there must be," and he says a natural means, but he could just as well have said a means of executing it. That is, it is necessary that what happens can be explained through the nature that God gives to things. And then in quote number 9, this point is sort of repeated in a stronger way. It's not sufficient to say that God created things in the beginning, will that they follow a law. If we imagine this will to have been so ineffective that things are not affected by it and no lasting effect was produced in them. But if indeed the law God laid down left some trace of itself impressed on things, if by his command things were formed in such a way that they were rendered appropriate for fulfilling the will of the command, and so on. Now, Malebranche could not accept the idea that the will of God leaves some nature or power in things to carry out the law. So what this suggests is that, now Leibniz thought that occasionalism was false, but he did not think it was incoherent. But what this suggests is that the reading of occasionalism that Bob gave us yesterday would for Leibniz be incoherent, because it would be a theory according to which God simply lays out a law, provides no inner feature of things to carry out the law, and therefore there's nothing in nature that carries out this law, which suggests that Leibniz would find that reading of occasionalism incoherent.
Are you directing your question?
Well, I'm trying. Well, yeah, like I said, I'm trying to stir up trouble. I mean, do you think that Leibniz, that would be Leibniz's reading of occasionalism?
So let me ask you this. You started with a premise. Leibniz believes that occasionalism is false but not incoherent. I'm not quite sure.
It's false because it attributes constant miracles to God, and that's I mean, it may be inconsistent with various theological principles, but
Yeah.
as a theory of power and causation, it's not incoherent.
I don't know, Bob, do you want to?
Well, actually, the question I would like to ask
Okay.
is one that,
Yeah. My question is an attempt, it's sort of a closely related pair of questions, and you can think of them as my trying to figure out how Malebranche might ask you about this, in a spirit of asking to find out rather than jumping to argue. So one question is, and I'll start with the petite perception. One question is, on your interpretation, what is it in the substance, the simple substance, that constitutes the derivative force? Is it just the actual petite perception plus the fact that their intentional object, confusedly perceived, is the best next state of the physical universe, that and nothing else, which seems to leave the question, well, what gets that translated from that to going on to the next set of petite perception and so forth, which seems, and the obvious answer, well, is it's the efficacy of God's will enacting the laws. That would be Malebranche's answer. And then how different is Leibniz's position from Malebranche? And the related question about the desire teleology is, does it have any causal efficacy at all? Or is it simply sort of pleasure